Ladies and gentlemen, Kirk Anthony Hamilton is an entrepreneur, investor, and designer from Kingston, Jamaica. He's the founder and CEO of Infinity Partnership, which has interests in the hospitality, entertainment, and lifestyle sectors. In May of 2015, Kirk Anthony was recognized as one of the 75th emerging global entrepreneurs by President Obama at the White House as part of the White House's Global Entrepreneurship Initiative. To talk to us today on building a digital innovation ecosystem and economy, please give a big, rousing Jamaican welcome to Kirk Anthony Hamilton.
Morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to try a few things today. So, firstly, my name is Kirk Anthony Hamilton, as pointed out. I am an architectural designer, actually, turned entrepreneur. And I'll share a bit with you about why, what we're trying to achieve, and therefore, in that, this approach to building out a digital innovation ecosystem, which could be termed in many, many other ways. I'm curious as to whether or not anyone in here has thought through why you all have scattered throughout the room and why people don't come together in the space. So I'm going to encourage, while I speak, if you would like, to come a bit closer. And there's a reason behind that that I'll share with you closer to the end, provided anybody does it. A few years ago, after studying in college architecture, with my desires and passions and such, I came back to Jamaica and noticed a few things that, to be quite honest, frustrated me. So, as people in the Caribbean, and I know I'm speaking to a global audience, I'll try to reach everyone in this, but as people from an island like Jamaica, we all know that we are a very famous brand known around the world. We have an incredible culture that reaches the world. We have icons such as Bob Marley and Usain Bolt and many others. But for some reason, on an economic standpoint, we simply have not managed to capitalize on this success. And so when I returned to Jamaica, I started looking at the landscape and started asking myself a couple questions. And initially, I took a very simplistic view. I was just going to somehow start inviting wealthy, innovative people to Jamaica because they already, according to me, came here and loved it, and have them meet with local entrepreneurs, investors, and such, so that we could unlock opportunity for the island. And the hope was that we could spread this throughout the Caribbean. As I said, it was a little bit of a naive view. I started out with the thought that I was going to host this party, and all these people were going to come. And I thought I knew the people I wanted to invite in, and very soon realized that I wasn't nearly in the space that I wanted to be in as yet. However, a lot has changed since then. This was back in 2014. And very quickly, we have managed to build a couple platforms that attract wealth, innovation, influence, and big media into the Caribbean region. And these are some of the pillars that we think are extremely important for building out a digital innovation ecosystem. So, what do I mean by that? Around the world, everyone is very familiar with Silicon Valley. I'm sure everyone in the room is. Yes? Yes, okay. So, very often you hear people trying to speak about building the next Silicon Valley. So, the Silicon Valley of Europe or the Silicon Valley of the Caribbean. I am not necessarily working to do that, but ultimately, what we're looking at is what allows ideas to thrive, right? One of the challenges that most emerging markets face is that typically, if a young person has an idea that they want to take from A to B, they find it very difficult to progress, not only from a standpoint of capital, which often is raised as the most, critical point when often it's not, but also from a simple standpoint of embrace. We tend not to be the greatest embracers of innovation. So when something new happens, what forces people, or what is it that makes people jump towards it, get behind it, and support it? And so I feel like the lady who spoke before me from Trend did a lot of my job today, but in a lot of those tools that she was talking about, if someone in Jamaica or most other emerging markets was to come up with a concept like the various ones she described, and we're all very familiar with the big four, but there are many others that proliferate around the world. If someone came up with these things in somewhere like Jamaica, would it be supported? And the general answer to the question is actually no. There are people who are trying and they're pushing through, but what we ultimately need and want is an environment where when you come up with something and you're trying to pursue it, and this is not only from an entrepreneurial perspective, but even from a corporate innovation perspective, that you operate within an environment that is willing to embrace shifts, change, etc. And that is the beautiful thing about Silicon Valley that most people have fallen in love with, which is that there's no such thing when you're in that space as a stupid idea. Whether or not you're going to get $100 million US in capital is not the question here. All it comes down to is there is a mindset that says that hopefully what you are working on will see the light of day. If I can support you, I will. And please keep me abreast of what you're doing, right? That's the kind of environment that we need. So, starting with this party that I had mentioned to you, some big shifts have happened in my life, which I'm hoping as as I share this story today, many of you will be able to have some takeaways that you can apply in your business and in your day-to-day lives as well. We have moved from hosting a party to having a brand or brands that have a tremendous level of global access. And so we are involved with organizations like the World Economic Forum. As was pointed out, I was recognized by the White House and President Obama in 2015. And there are many other circles that we've managed to find ourselves in that really allow us to connect with the world in a very unique way. And all of this has come from this goal of driving this innovation ecosystem, this ecosystem of embrace. A few years ago, I had a conversation that kind of put it in perspective in terms of what we need to do and how emerging markets differ from Silicon Valley. Because many times what happens is people look at the Valley and they think, okay, I want to start the next Uber, I want to start the next Airbnb, I want to start the next WhatsApp. But what is often missing for players in these markets is if you're not in Silicon Valley, then you have to think a little bit different. And very often we try to start from the end instead of starting from the beginning. So in a market like Silicon Valley or San Francisco overall, the path to the creation of a successful idea is extremely linear, right? Or increasingly linear. Because you come up with an idea and there is almost a design pathway through, if you follow this, you will have access to funding, you will have people using your platform, you will have situations where you have a certain level of support and a foundation that will help you to be successful. That is not the case in most emerging market territories, and so the encouragement is for us to move into a space where we start building the foundation first as entrepreneurs, as corporate entities, as innovators, and then get to the other part of success. So I guess I want to give myself a little bit of credibility as to why I'm on this stage and why I'm speaking to you today. So my first slide just simply shares with you a few of the people who we work to connect with. And this is more about connecting the Caribbean with global influence than it is about me hanging out with any of these folks. But it is about getting the name Jamaica and the wider Caribbean into the mouths of the right people, right? There are forces around the world who control the movement of capital, who control innovation, who push change every day, that have an invaluable level of influence to the success of almost anywhere, especially when we're talking about innovation. And so one of the most critical things we thought was necessary was to be able to connect with global influence. And that is why this platform that you're a part of today is so important, because beyond the people in the room, there is a broad global audience understanding that this conversation is happening from Jamaica. And that has happened over the last 3 days. So the more mouths that we can put our name in, the better off we're going to be. As was pointed out in the last presentation, the biggest foundation that we probably have to build on here is mobile, right? There are way more devices in the world now than people, and Jamaica is very fortunate, much like most of the Caribbean, to have a pretty solid internet infrastructure and mobile infrastructure. But in line with what I'm saying, you might realize the next big challenge is, why isn't anyone building anything? So why aren't there local apps that you use every day, much in the same way that you utilize some of the tools that were pointed out? And I think, Loop from Trend Media is a very good example of one thing that is, highly localized, that has managed to spread its wings beyond just Jamaica or the Caribbean shores. But the reality of the matter is, many of us in here have 50, 60 apps on our phone. How many of them come from here? And how often do you hear someone trying to create one? And when you hear them trying to create it, how supportive are you in terms of downloading it, using it, and helping to make their vision a success? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, there's a tremendous shift on the way in the world that has been kind of captured and focused on by the World Economic Forum. I'm curious to know how many people in the room are familiar with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Okay, so essentially the Fourth Industrial Revolution looks at the fact that in the world today, because of the amount of connected devices we have, primarily right now we look at cell phones, and the amount of connected devices we're expected to have, when you talk about the Internet of Things and people planning to make your fridge more connected, your television, all of these different items that we use daily, your car, super connected. There is a change on the way that brings both massive challenges and at the same time huge opportunities, right? This shift actually is possibly one of the greatest opportunities that any emerging market has ever had, because ultimately the world is undergoing a change unlike anything we've seen for maybe a century, right? The internet, the launch of the internet was probably one of the last big shifts, but it doesn't nearly compare to the kind of transformation that we're starting to talk about. And this is the first time in our history that a shift in the form of an industrial revolution has actually been predicted. Most of them we speak about after the fact. So as you know, we know about the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution led to the mass production of products. And then the third industrial revolution had a little bit less of a staunch impact in the sense of computerization and automation, sorry. And then now we're in the fourth industrial revolution, which really looks at the fact that with all of these different connected devices, we're opening up doors and opportunities to new things, but we also present challenges. And one of the big challenges that you'll hear many people speak about is that this revolution is centered on the smartphone, right? Most of us in here probably have smartphones, if not all. But there's a population just outside our doors and many beyond in the rest of the world who don't. And so what you have happening is, while many enjoy the conveniences of Uber and Airbnb and all of these different platforms, there are many who are unable to, and ultimately what that drives is another kind of wealth separation gap. And that is something that all markets have to be very conscious of, because typically when you hear people talk about technology, we talk about a very level playing field, right? But the reality is, if you can't afford a device, if you can't afford a smart fridge, if you can't afford a smart TV, then we're starting to separate populations. But at the same time, we've created a space where people are able to build things and build them rapidly and put them directly into the hands of consumers very quickly, right? So you see these companies scaling at a pace that is unmatched. And what you want to be able to do, or what we want to be able to do, is bring that kind of consciousness and environment into the Caribbean. Next slide. I won't stay too long on this one, but ultimately we're living in the future. More and more, if you watch the movie Back to the Future or any of these shows from the 90s where we used to think these things could never happen, and ultimately we seem to have missed a few years when you talk about things like the electric car, etc. When I was in primary prep school in the 90s, they used to talk about electric cars. They didn't become very real until about 2010, 2012. With Tesla taking it mass market. But the fact of the matter is that we've taken a big leap forward in the last 8 years or so, whereby just about anything you can imagine is becoming possible. And now you're starting to hear about self-driving cars and many other incredible tools. And what I usually say to people from emerging markets like Jamaica is, we have to understand that there are forces and capital at play that are very hard to compete with, in the sense of not catching up with these shifts that are underway. So when the biggest investors in the world want to see certain things happen, when Google, Amazon, Facebook and such are pushing, driverless cars, drone delivery and all of these kind of things, it is a bit misguided in my eyes for us to assume or to decide that we don't want to embrace these things and see how best to make them work where we are, because they're somewhat inevitable more and more, right? And since in many cases we aren't designing them, we're not in control. So how do you create a system where we start to become in control, where we start to build the things that we want to see, and we're able to kind of push against the things that we don't want, ultimately? So we're living in a new democracy, right? If you really think about it, the way the world is right now, and this has benefited me tremendously, it can benefit many, many people, but more and more you see a change in how, for example, news platforms operate, because people now own their news through social media and such. The fact of the matter is that if I have a story to get out, it's not necessarily easy, but I'm better positioned now than I ever was to get that story out to my own audience on my own than trying to feed it to people through these pockets of news media that typically used to control how news got out. And this new democracy involves things like the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world, whereby the doors are being opened in a transactional economy to just about everyone. You have something you want to sell, we want you to be able to sell it. And people are creating these platforms or marketplaces that are creating tremendous value for some people and changing lives. And this is going to be an essential part of the development of a new ecosystem. So I won't stay on this one for long, but we all know, I believe, these, not only these companies, but this general ideology that has developed whereby we talk about the fact that Airbnb is the biggest hotel company in the world but owns no hotel rooms. Uber is the largest transportation company in the world but doesn't have any cars and such like that. And so what I'm going to dive into now is the transformative thinking that you want to see happening in the world, or sorry, in our markets to start to drive these kind of enterprises being developed. So this is the big thing for me. In many emerging markets, and it was pointed to by the lady who did the streamed presentation earlier, right? This thing of copycatting, right? Recreating what is already there. And many times in our markets, what you see happening is that people get up and they say, I'm going to build the Uber of Jamaica. I want to build the Airbnb of the Caribbean. And as she pointed out, that is somewhat pointless and very difficult to do. What we need to have happening is that people start thinking transformatively and start thinking on the grounds of how does what I'm doing impact lives? And ultimately, what you'll notice is the world is moving from a space where people create very transactional companies that simply want to extract value from their customer base to creating platforms. People are creating marketplaces of opportunity, and that mindset is translating globally. And in order to compete, emerging markets like ours wanting to build digital innovation ecosystems have to adapt. And that means that people have to be thinking in that same space as to how is what I'm doing going to impact. So if you think about it, when insurance companies would not insure cars for Uber, they ultimately had to build almost their own internal insurance platform, right? It's the same thing when you think about organizations like Airbnb in terms of the tools that they're continuously enabling their users with to be able to service the clients who come in. And so the idea of building community is more and more critical and important. And it's a big shift away from what we used to know, right? Because there was a time where all that would happen is company builds a product, let's say it's a soft drink, puts it on the shelves, splashes some advertising in front of you, and that's basically their job. You go in the supermarket, you pick it up. But more and more, people have so much in front of them, as we've been hearing today, that they're becoming increasingly disengaged. And so if we can't find ways to connect to the consumer in a more meaningful way, then ultimately we've lost them. So you see brands participating in marketing initiatives that often look very unusual for the space that they may operate in, whereby what they're trying to do now, as opposed to before, is build and engage with the community and stay connected and have people feel like the brand actually means more than just the product and the transaction. It's no longer just about you have something, I want your money, and that's it, right? And as you would have seen maybe in a slide before, they're saying more and more clever marketing is losing out to ultimately reality, because there was a time where you could just jump up and say, I have the greatest product in the world, and splash it in a newspaper ad. And people would see it, and that's all they would have to go with. But increasingly, people are in a position where the first thing you do when you hear about a product is you go online, you review it. As was pointed out earlier, you probably check out 20 different places before you buy it. And you're checking for validity. How many people have ever seen an ad on Facebook for, let's say, a shoe or clothes or something like that, and you think it looks really cool, but you've never heard of the company? And then you go and you click on the comments, you see that there are probably like 1,000 comments, and when you look in the comments, all are bad. Anybody? Okay. So that is the new shift, because there was a time where that company would put that shoe out, they would say it's wonderful, people would go buy it, and then people didn't have the tools to go back to the market and say, this product actually sucks, you shouldn't buy it. But that's the space we're living in. So there are more and more companies that are feeling the brunt of this, whereby you put a message out and you claim one thing, but it's not real. And the force that they're not expecting to meet upon usually, because this kind of happens in a quick snap, is the force of the new democracy that comes against their product to say to the world, actually what they're saying is not true, right? So integrating a bit of what I've heard earlier today, you know, the brand story becomes extremely essential, but also companies are being forced to create a level of quality and to embrace community in a way that they never had to before. And so in order to compete globally, we have to be thinking the same way. Next, please. So one of the things I missed out on from the last one was just the idea of empowering people. In thinking about these transformative platforms, the main idea behind most of these companies is putting tools in the hands of individuals, no matter their background, to allow them to be successful in the world. So this kind of shows you a little bit of the behind the scenes in an app like Uber, where, you know, as I mentioned, they're arming people with tools that typically companies never used to have to think about before, right? Your car company simply sells you a car. That was back in the day. More and more you'll see, to give a more elementary look at even what's going on in the local landscape, they have to be finding all the resources to help you to be successful. So you go into a car dealership in Jamaica now as compared to even 8 to 10 years ago, and what you'll notice is every one of them has a finance partner to help you to be successful. So there's a more elementary approach kind of happening on the ground, but we want to shift this to a more technology-driven and broader-based empowerment model. Next slide, please. So this is simply a look at a plethora of different companies operating in numerous different spaces, and the idea of the Internet of Things, which is, quite frankly, the next phase of most emerging markets, especially Jamaica and the Caribbean, with our fairly solid internet infrastructure. This is the next phase in our development. But what it ultimately needs or means is that people start building over what we already have, and people embrace those ideas. And I think I've sat on that for a little while today, so I'll just move ahead to the next one. Okay, so simply going back to the same concept of back to the future and the fact that we're living in the now. The encouragement is for people to build things again that transform lives. And this is I think a fairly simple example of how even the home has become ultimately an enterprise. Because if you look at the amount of companies centered around simply the idea of providing you tools within your home to make your life easier, it's actually quite interesting what is happening here, because none of these companies really have any kind of footprint inside your house, which speaks to the possibilities within a place like Jamaica and the wider Caribbean in terms of what people could be building, because we're no longer living in this space where having a business really means building a washing machine that is very capital intensive, etc., for people to have. It is a lot cheaper now to do the things that people are doing and get started than it ever has been before. And whether as an entrepreneur or a corporate entity, there are ways to enter people's lives nowadays, hopefully without being intrusive, that are far different from anything that we've seen before. But again, what this requires is people building the tools that ultimately end up on a showcase like this to say that they're entering the home, capitalizing on needs, providing a service and therefore being rewarded. So I haven't used the term for the day. It probably is overused, but ultimately I feel very confident that the Caribbean, much like most emerging markets, are ripe for disruption. Right? We live in a space where you have a few players who have owned the market for just about all of our lives. And for the first time in our history, and this has been going on for a few years, so the encouragement is for us to try and catch up. But for the first time in our history, people are being armed with the tools to enter into these spaces and to compete with these large entities in a way that we just were never given the opportunity before. But we have to be mindful and encouraging of these new ideas in order for them to become successful, so that you see more competition in the marketplace, you see more items come to the table, and increasingly you have more and more options to leverage so that you can have the conveniences that many of us yearn for when we're in a place like this, thinking back to our trips to wherever else in the world, right? And I'm saying all of this while making it very clear, I'm the biggest ambassador of Jamaica anywhere, right? I love this place through and through, and the narrative we carry whenever we go anywhere else is that Jamaica is set for tremendous economic growth, and Jamaica is the best place in the world to live. I'm going to end on this note, but to work to capture everything that I have tried to share today, I want to put forward something that I usually ask audiences in Jamaica and the Caribbean especially. A couple years ago, not last year, the year before, I was in Australia with my brother. He happens to live there. He's married to an Australian girl. He's Jamaican though. And I went out one night to a bar with a few friends, and the name of the bar, or the name of the place I went to, was Butter, okay? And Butter was a Korean fried chicken restaurant that served champagne and sold expensive sneakers, right? And I sat inside Butter that night, and I was kind of looking around and saying to myself, if somebody came up with this idea in Jamaica or anywhere in the Caribbean, would it be allowed to be successful? And it didn't take me long to answer myself and say no. And I looked behind the bar, and the owners of the restaurant, or the establishment, were three young guys. It was quite a diverse grouping. One was Asian, one was Caucasian, and I don't remember what the other one was. But it hit me again, this idea of embrace of innovation, because the reality of the matter is there are many markets that we yearn for these kind of conveniences, we yearn for these marketplaces, we yearn for these efficient tools, but we're not living in an environment that is supportive and embracing of these novelties, and we don't realize often how all of this adds up and comes together, right? So when I thought about Butter and what was going on there, and the fact that if you really think about it, and there's a change to this, there's a place now called Broken Plate in Kingston, which is I think the ultimate driving force when you think about what is happening in the food industry, where young people around the world are bringing out extremely creative ideas. They probably are the closest thing that we have to that right now, where a young chef has been given the empowerment and the tools to try and build a business around these creative ideas. But for a very long time, that wasn't our food marketplace. And hopefully you'll see more and more of that. But I hope that these kind of varying examples give you an idea of what I'm trying to share, which is that we're in a place now where for our lifetimes, nobody has managed to build a broken plate. And That has been far too long, and we want to see a change in that. And broken plate is just one example of something much, much bigger, right? Whereby what we want to do or want to have is a marketplace that embraces innovation, right? And this is innovation both in products and marketing, etc., so that you start to see a shift and the creation of new enterprise where people are able to do what they want to do and build on their ideas and be as creative as they would like, so that they can live full and meaningful lives. And ultimately, that's what we'd like to achieve, and I hope, that you all found some value in what I've shared, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kirk. No, you're not going anywhere just yet. We have space for about two questions from our auditorium, and then we're going to head on over to Raj. We have one lady there with her hand up. I see you. Can we have a microphone to her, please? We have another question right here, and that will be our two questions.
Hi, Kirk. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, when we are in the age we are in and we have creative and innovative ideas, how do we push through to get the funding to get it done? Because in Jamaica, the persons who control the purse strings are still the persons who are thinking conservatively. And when you present your business plan and it is based on something that the examples are in America, England, Australia, the feedback you get a lot of the time is this won't work for Jamaica. So how do we create the partnerships we need to create to get the support for the funding for innovative things?
So that is a part of what we are trying to achieve. I'll be as brief as possible with the response. I'll give you the quick side of, a lot of what you see in America and the UK, etc., is not always reality, in the sense of, not every idea in America or the UK gets funded, first and foremost, and not every business plan, no matter how brilliant, gets off the ground. There are many communities in those markets that have very similar challenges to the ones we face in the Caribbean and other emerging markets. But that being said, as my entire presentation was around this idea of the lack of embrace, ultimately one way to shift that is to do two things, right? There's always this question as to whether something will work in the Caribbean or not based on, let's say, credit card or debit card penetration. And so my encouragement to anybody who's looking to build a credit card or debit card based platform or business is, well, first you might have to get involved in credit card penetration, right? And that, I don't know the exact solution to that, but when I spoke about the fact that we tend to start from the end and not the beginning, that is the challenging narrative, right? Because if I get up and I want to start a credit card based company in the US, the reality is they have a significant level of credit card penetration. Jamaica and the Caribbean doesn't have that. So there is a reason why an investor is going to get up and say, well, this might not work or this isn't going to work, unless you present a compelling argument that, well, while we're building this out, this is how we're actually going to get these tools into the hands of these people, right? So that would be one thing. But then the other thing is just greater levels of competition, right? The idea of liberating a market where in a place like Jamaica, we have 8 banks, and that's it. And most people can name 5, right? The reality of the matter is, and I don't look to banks as the solution to our problems, nor are they the funders of new ideas, etc. I'm just using the industry of banks as an example. You need new things to come in order for people to be forced into competition whereby they have to support other initiatives, right? For decades, Jamaica had one flour company. And recently someone launched a new plant and now they're going to sell flour. I won't jump into my thoughts on that, but if you see what I'm saying, there are a lot of controlled markets in Jamaica and the Caribbean that give an opportunity for disruption where people can open up the space a bit more. And that would be the encouragement, is to look at things that need to be, that offer an opportunity for disruption, and then open up that space.
All right. I know we had said we only have space for two questions. I'm sure that answered your question, right? Right. And Kirk will be around if we have any other questions following this question, right?
Hi, good morning, everyone. All right, so my question is about persons in Jamaica who are very creative, very innovative in terms of how they think, but we tend to be in a space where, as you mentioned, do not really embrace change very well. So I look at this space in terms of what Jamaica has been doing to try and hone those persons with those innovative minds and creative mindsets. But what do you think needs to really happen? You spoke about Silicon Valley, but unfortunately, Jamaica is not. But what is it you think can be done by all the players in Jamaica to come together to facilitate this so that persons can then share their ideas? They can also build on what they already are thinking, and it doesn't get lost in translation. So I want to know what your response would be, your feedback. Thank you.
That's a big one. I think the most important thing you touched on there is coming together, right? And the reality of Jamaica and the Caribbean, as much as we tend to think we are small and everybody knows everybody and this kind of culture, I would argue that in the creative space, for example, there is no real coming together. You have a few people who know each other and they tend to hang out, but there are no, firm industry lobbyists, for example, would be the best term that I could use. There are very few spaces where you see people really trying to come together and collaborate to build something bigger than what one can do, right? Oftentimes we suffer from the complex of trying to go at it alone, right? As opposed to people really coming on the backs of each other and supporting each other. So for example, even with what I'm doing, what we've worked to do is build a movement around technology because we want to be able to build certain technologies in this market. But the first thing that we needed was a movement, a group of people who embrace ideas, who have capital, who are doing things to be able to do such. And I don't think that that is necessarily happening in the traditional creative space yet, but that's one of the things that I would suggest. There's a need in the Caribbean for more and more platforms like what this is, where people come together and they center around a subject matter and they start working together and they're able to remain connected because of technology.
Thank you. Very good answer. Thank you so much, Kirk. We're handing over now to Raj. Let's see if he has any question before you step away just yet.
Yeah.
Raj,
Yeah,
we're
thank you
handing
very
over
much,
to you.
Debbie.
Do you have any
Yeah,
questions?
Kirk,
Do we have time
thank
for
you
any
so
questions
much.
that you'd
It was
like to ask of
a
Kirk?
great motivational talk, and also the examples that you brought in, it's really awesome. And, I can feel myself there was a great transformation on your speech. Hope to talk to you a lot more. I just have one quick question from Lynn O'Neill. How can I I'm sorry, how to find what digital marketing technique would work for a startup business entrepreneur?
So I am not the expert in that. But, it was pointed to earlier that the internet is the marketplace, right? So the beautiful thing about the world we're living in now is not only can you search for tools in many cases that are free, but much like was presented by the CEO of Trend, there are many of these best practices, etc., that are supported by entrepreneurs and I guess in the marketing space, the marketers who have done the things that you want to do, who have put this out on the internet for you to be able to find. And essentially, there are many, many playbooks out there for people to adapt to. We've managed to build a brand on the basis of social media, and so we've gotten our story out through the typical platforms and channels. I don't know that we necessarily, or I know the exact tools as such that go behind the scenes of that, but that would be my encouragement is follow the people who have done the things that you want to do, especially from a global standpoint. Most people have put somewhat of information out there around the playbook that you can follow, including many of the tools that they use to
Yes, thank
achieve
you
their
very
level
much.
of success.
Thank you very much, Kirk.